You're listening to episode 906 of the Father Bills Podcast. Welcome back. In this week's episode, we have our permanent deacon, Deacon Brett Edmonson, giving the homily, and this will be the third of our four-part series on the Eucharist, and it's entitled Receive Communion in Order to Be Communion, given on the third Sunday in Advent, 2023.
Good morning, everybody. Well, we are making our way through. We're almost there, 1 week to go, so good job. So this weekend, we're at part 3 of our 4-part preaching series on being Eucharistic people. If you were here 2 weeks ago, you might remember Father Bill preached on the sacrificial nature of the Eucharist and how sacrifice is kind of the mark of all genuine love in our lives. And then last weekend, Father Anthony preached about the healing, that power of the Eucharist, and how some of that healing takes place really, or can take place, in any meal that we share in love with one another. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about communion itself, and specifically the connection between our receiving communion and our mission to be agents of communion. And I want to start with a little story. So years ago, when I was working downtown, I began to go to Mass at the downtown chapel. So Father Dick Berg had just been made pastor there, and he was beginning to revive what pretty much was a dead parish at the time. So I would go, and after some time, I started noticing this woman who would show up regularly. She looked homeless, and many of the folks down there were. So she pushed around a shopping cart that was kind of piled high with her belongings, and she had this big hood that she would always wear over her head. She was obviously not in the best of health. She didn't talk to anybody, and nobody really talked to her. Well, one day after Mass, this woman, whose name was Mary, she approached Father Berg and she said, "You know, I used to play the organ. I noticed you don't have any music during Mass." And so Father Berg, he stopped and he looked at her and he said, "Well, Mary, would you like to play for us at Mass?" And Mary said, "Well, maybe, but I need to be able to practice." And so Father Berg, he said, "Well, you're welcome to come in and practice." So he would open the chapel up during the day for her. She would come in and sit at the organ and practice. And eventually, she did indeed start playing for us at our weekend Masses. Well, friends, it was awful. It became better eventually, kind of. But to suffice it to say, Mary was not going to be auditioning anywhere anytime soon. And yet, you know, it kind of fit, because really nothing that we did down there with our Masses was very polished. And so Mary's efforts, her putting herself out there every week, they were taken in stride, and people thanked her for them. And then they started talking to her. And then they started saying hello to her and goodbye to her. And friends, that was the beginning of this remarkable transformation for Mary. It's not like she ever became an accomplished organist, but what she did become was a powerhouse in the revival of that church. So she would be the first to notice newcomers, especially those who didn't seem like they quite fit in. She would share her meager possessions with those in need. Eventually, she even started a food pantry down there. It was called Mary's Pantry. It was in an old, unused closet up on the second floor. And there she was at Mass every weekend, behind the organ, putting it out there, sharing herself with us. Everybody knew Mary, and Mary knew everybody. And while she could be a real battle axe, what she didn't want you to know was that underneath that facade was a warm and kind and delightful heart. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't really hide that. It just needed the right soil in which to blossom. So Mary became for me and remains for me to this day a sign of what can happen when somebody is welcomed into communion. Communion with the body of Christ, but also communion with the body of Christ. St. Augustine once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, "We receive communion in order to be communion." We receive communion in order to be communion. Oftentimes, we think that communion is just about us and Jesus, and it's true. When we receive the Eucharist, the Lord comes to us in an incredibly personal and intimate way. But when we encounter the Lord in this way, we're also becoming places where Jesus, at least potentially, can be encountered by others. Think about it. At communion time, the Lord comes into our hearts, right? He dwells there. And so whenever we welcome somebody else into our heart, the Lord is there to meet them, whether they realize it or not. So our communion is a means by which Jesus can enter into communion with others who may not know him or who may have walked away from him. It's almost like Jesus uses us, like he uses our love to slip in covertly, unnoticed, past the defenses of those whose hearts might be closed against him for whatever reason. I find that encouraging. And maybe especially for those of us that have loved ones that have stopped practicing, or maybe those of us who have people in our lives whose path in life worries us, concerns us, those of us who are heartbroken by the pain and the loneliness, or maybe even the violence in the lives of those we meet each day. Friends, the Lord asks us to be communion for those outside of communion, to be the body of Christ for those outside the body of Christ, to be the love by which others come to know and accept the love of Jesus, even if they don't know it's the love of Jesus. Bishop Barron noted it in one of his recent reflections that the Eucharist is the ultimate healer. Therapy, self-understanding, loving friends, and disciplined self-effort, he said, those are all good and important, but in the end, they can only take us so far and not into full healing. Full healing, he said, comes from touching and being touched by the sacred. What that means is that because of what we receive at this altar, because of who we receive at this altar, our love can be not just our love, but an encounter with the sacred itself. In the Eucharist, we have a unique and uniquely powerful gift for healing. Maybe that can be a litmus test for us. As we come here week after week and receive communion, are we finding ourselves not just consoled by communion, but charged to go out and seek communion with others? Are we becoming more aware of the hurts and the needs of others, or are we stuck on our own? More deeply, are we walking away from Mass each week pretty much unchanged, or are we becoming more joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, generous, gentle, self-controlled? Because communion ought to change us, friends, not to be better rule followers, not to be more pious, but to be more concerned, selfless, and sacrificing. And if that's not happening, it's worth asking ourselves, are we allowing the Lord in the Eucharist to touch the broken places in our own hearts? Maybe you've heard it said that wounded people tend to wound. Wounded people tend to wound. The opposite is also true. Connected people tend to connect. So this morning, as you approach this altar to receive, be mindful of what it is you're doing and who you're receiving. Receive communion in order to be communion.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Father Bills podcast. Now, this coming weekend, now I'm producing this on Monday, December 18th. Coming the following weekend is the last, well, let's just say it's the fourth Sunday of Advent, and that is on Sunday. You can go to Mass on the Eve this Saturday, which will be still the fourth Sunday celebration of Advent. But here's the catch. Right after this morning Masses in your parishes, at least I know in ours, we then start shifting to Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve actually starts in the evening on Sunday, when Christmas Day is on a Monday. Okay, that seems pretty simple, but that means we need to be going to two Masses to fulfill our Catholic obligation. You know, we promise as Catholics to worship and to be with God, and as He invites us to come to Him through the Mass, and the Church's guidance is that this should be done on the greatest solemnities. Of course, solemnities are Sundays every Sunday, but also Christmas is that one big one. If Sunday's a Super Bowl or a game, then Christmas is the Super Bowl. So here's the deal. I recommend that you go to Mass on Saturday evening, if you do that normally, or Sunday morning, as you might, and then go to Christmas Eve later in the evening or Christmas Day. And that's your 2 Masses. But here's the catch. Here's the weird thing. Let's suppose you go to if the only Mass you go to on the weekend is on Sunday, let's say at 4 p.m. Now, Sunday 4 p.m. for us is a Christmas Mass, but that might not be for others. Some are still doing Sunday morning services on a 4 p.m. slot. So what do you do? Well, the church has people. I've seen this on Facebook and other places. They've built a chart. But basically, you have to fulfill the 2 Masses, the obligation for the Advent and one for the Christmas celebration. So you could go to 4 p.m. Wherever you're going and make that your 4th Sunday of Advent commitment, even though the readings are not the 4th Sunday. And then you can go again, or you need to go again, for maybe Christmas either later that day or in the next day, which would probably make more sense. I know that's weird, but that's what happens when Christmas lands on a Monday, because Christmas Eve's on a Sunday, and oh my goodness. Yep. Well, nonetheless, I hope you can figure that out. Try to make it really simple for yourself. I know here at Holy Trinity, we are canceling our 11:15 a.m. Mass so that we can do the prep work in the church for Christmas Eve Masses. Besides, also the number of Masses that we've been doing is extraordinary. Some parishes have way more than we will have, of course, our Saturday. But if I start counting them up between Saturday and Monday, we'll have, let's see, Saturday's 1, the 2 morning Masses, that makes a total of 3 now. And then we have 3 Christmas Eve, that's 6. And then we have a 7th one on Christmas Day. So that's a lot of Masses for us as a parish to pull off. And so we got to be mindful of our ability to do these things and also the wear and tear. As priests can only say so many Masses. We're fine, of course, at Holy Trinity, but there's other places that are even much more difficult situation than we are. And just be patient with your priest this weekend. And, here's something I would recommend. We talked about this in our announcements. On Christmas, when you come, if you're a regular goer to your parish, and you have your spot, whether it be a pew or whether it be the parking spot, I want to encourage you to let go of that for Christmas. That means park further away or sit somewhere else. Do not expect that people know where you sit and where you park and that they will reserve it, right? That's not reasonable. So do everybody a favor. If you're a regular, be welcoming to those who are new, because we get lots of people who are new. How might you help them? That would mean everybody would park further away if they could, or sit in the, let's say, less desirable seats in this church so that those who are new can get those prime spots, right? We should be saving seats. We should be giving them away so we evangelize and help others who have not been with us for a while. You getting what I'm saying? I hope so. I know it sounds crazy. It may be, but we're about not ourselves when we come to Mass. We're about giving ourselves away. That's more important than anything else. In fact, as we come to Mass, sometimes we're struggling. Christmas is a difficult time. Sometimes it's very sad because this is when someone who has normally been with us, like a year ago, is maybe passed on or whatever, broken relationship may have occurred. But in this case, instead of coming just to get fed, which is an important thing, or receive some healing, which is also an important thing, also make an effort to get out of yourself, to give yourself away, to let go and let other people have their place because they're new or unfamiliar, and you've done a good deed by sacrificing your comfort for them. That's one of the greatest forms of love, which I mentioned as what it is to be Eucharistic people in the first of these 4 part of our series, and this would be a great way to put it into action. Okay, I'm done preaching. This exit, or the conclusion here is almost as long as Deacon Brett's homily. I encourage you to go to my website, fatherbill.org. If you like this podcast, I encourage you to like it or give a thumbs up or whatever it is, or share it with whomever you'd like. And we'll just see where that goes. I'm not looking for the clicks, but again, it's a matter of evangelization to help spread the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the meantime, may God bless you and have a great rest of your Advent and Christmas season. Bye-bye.